In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where manicured lawns and picket fences paint a picture of American tranquility, an ordinary summer afternoon was about to become anything but. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that makes clothes stick to skin and tempers flare at the slightest provocation. It was on this day that a simple misunderstanding would spark a confrontation that would ripple through the community, forcing everyone to confront their deepest held beliefs and prejudices. Meet John Thompson, a respected prosecutor with 15 years of experience under his belt. At 42, John had seen it all in the courtroom, from petty theft to high-profile murder cases, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold in his own front yard. John and his wife Sarah had moved into the neighborhood just 3 months ago, drawn by the promise of good schools for their two young children and the sense of community that seemed to radiate from every well-tended garden. As John mowed his lawn that fateful Saturday, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was the weight of 1,000 microaggressions he experienced since moving in. The nervous smiles, the way some neighbors crossed the street when they saw him coming, the surprise in people's voices when they learned what he did for a living. John had hoped things would be different here, but old habits, it seemed, died hard. Across the street lived Margaret Wilson, a retired schoolteacher who'd called this neighborhood home for over 3 decades. To Margaret, change came slowly, and not always for the better. She'd watched as families moved in and out, as children grew up and left for college, as the world beyond their little enclave seemed to grow more chaotic by the day. Margaret prided herself on being the neighborhood watchdog, always on alert for anything, or anyone, that seemed out of place. As John finished up his yard work, wiping sweat from his brow, he noticed Margaret peering out from behind her curtains. It wasn't the first time he'd caught her staring, but today felt different. There was an intensity in her gaze that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. John tried to shake off the unease, reminding himself that he had every right to be here, that this was his home too. Inside her house, Margaret's fingers hovered over her phone. She'd been debating making the call all afternoon. Those people, the Thompsons, just didn't fit in. Always coming and going at odd hours, having loud conversations on their porch, letting their children play unsupervised in the front yard. And now, she was sure she'd seen John tampering with the Johnsons' car next door. It was probably nothing, but what if it wasn't? Wasn't it her duty to report suspicious activity? Before she could second-guess herself, Margaret dialed 911. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the dispatcher, describing what she'd seen, or thought she'd seen. A tall black man, suspicious behavior, possible car theft in progress. The words tumbled out, a jumble of half-truths and assumptions that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. As police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, John's heart began to race. He knew all too well how these situations could escalate, how quickly things could go wrong. Sarah appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "John, what's going on?" she called out, their children peering curiously from behind her legs. John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get a word out, 2 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of his house. Officers poured out, hands on their holsters, voices raised as they shouted commands. "Hands where we can see them. Step away from the vehicle." In that moment, as neighbors began to gather on their lawns to watch the drama unfold, John Thompson faced a choice. He could comply silently, swallowing his anger and indignation as he had so many times before. Or he could stand his ground, assert his rights, and force everyone present to confront the ugly truth behind this confrontation. As he slowly raised his hands, John's mind raced. How would he explain this to his kids? What would his colleagues at the district attorney's office say? And most importantly, how could he turn this moment into something more than just another statistic, another example of the everyday injustices faced by people who looked like him? The next few minutes would change everything, not just for John and his family, but for Margaret, the responding officers, and the entire neighborhood. As tensions rose and misconceptions collided with reality, the true nature of justice, community, and what it means to be a good neighbor would be put to the test. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning. As the summer sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the once peaceful street, the stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to question their assumptions, face their fears, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to bridge the divide that had silently grown between them. In the tense silence that followed, broken only by the crackle of police radios and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, John Thompson took a deep breath. He knew that what happened next would define not just this moment, but the future of his family in this community. As he prepared to speak, to reveal his identity and challenge the assumptions that had led to this point, he couldn't help but wonder, in a world where snap judgments can have life-altering consequences, is it ever truly possible to see beyond the surface and recognize the humanity in one another? The answer to that question would unfold in the coming hours and days, as this ordinary neighborhood became the unlikely battleground for a much larger conversation about race, privilege, and the American dream. But for now, with all eyes on him and the weight of history pressing down, John Thompson stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. The truth, he knew, had a power all its own, and it was time to let it speak. John Thompson's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I'm John Thompson, Assistant District Attorney for this county. This is my home, and I was simply helping my neighbor jumpstart their car." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The officers exchanged glances, their hands slowly moving away from their holsters as the reality of the situation began to sink in. From her vantage point across the street, Margaret Wilson felt her world tilt on its axis. The man she'd reported, the man she'd been watching with suspicion for weeks, was a prosecutor. She felt a flush of shame creep up her neck, but it was quickly replaced by indignation. How was she supposed to know? It wasn't her fault if he didn't fit her idea of what a lawyer should look like. As the initial shock wore off, the neighborhood erupted into a flurry of whispered conversations and pointed looks. Sarah Thompson stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped protectively around their children, her eyes never leaving her husband. She'd known something like this might happen when they moved here, but the reality of it was still a punch to the gut. Officer Mike Chen, a 10-year veteran of the force, stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for the misunderstanding. We received a call about suspicious activity, and we're simply responding to the report." His words were professional, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort in his voice. He'd been in situations like this before, caught between duty and the growing awareness of racial bias in policing. John nodded, his posture relaxing slightly but his eyes still sharp. "I understand, Officer Chen, you were doing your job. But I think we all know there's more to this story than a simple misunderstanding." He gestured to the gathering crowd of neighbors, some looking embarrassed, others defiant. "This is about assumptions, about who belongs and who doesn't." As if on cue, Tom Johnson, John's next-door neighbor and the owner of the car in question, pushed through the crowd. "What the hell is going on here? John was helping me with my car. We've been out here for the past hour trying to get it started." Tom's face was red with anger and confusion, his eyes darting between John, the police officers, and the rest of the neighbors. The revelation sent another ripple through the crowd. Margaret felt her certainty crumble further. She'd been so sure she'd seen something suspicious, but now she wasn't sure of anything. Officer Chen's partner, a younger cop named Ethan Rodriguez, stepped up. "Sir, we're going to need to see some identification." The words were out of his mouth before he could think better of them, a reflex born of training and habit. John's eyes narrowed. "Officer Rodriguez, I've already identified myself. I'm an officer of the court. Are you asking me to prove my right to exist in my own front yard?" The question hung in the air, charged with centuries of history and pain. Officer Rodriguez faltered, suddenly aware of the minefield he'd stumbled into. That's not what I meant, sir. It's just procedure." "Procedure," John repeated, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "Let's talk about procedure. Let's talk about how quickly this situation could have escalated if I hadn't been who I am. Let's talk about the assumptions that led to this moment." As John spoke, Sarah made her way down the front steps, their children still clinging to her legs. She placed a hand on her husband's arm, a gesture of support and a gentle reminder of the watching eyes. "John," she said softly, "maybe we should take this inside." But John wasn't ready to retreat. Not yet. He turned to face his neighbors, his gaze sweeping over faces both familiar and strange. "I want to believe that we can be better than this," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "I want to believe that we can look at each other and see people, not threats. But that takes work. It takes honesty." Margaret, still watching from her porch, felt something shift inside her. The certainty that had driven her to make that call was crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of shame and confusion. She'd always prided herself on being the good neighbor, on looking out for her community. But had she really been protecting anyone? Or had she simply been giving in to her own fears and prejudices? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the once peaceful street, the neighborhood found itself at a crossroads. The simple act of a man mowing his lawn had laid bare the fault lines running beneath their community, lines of race, class, and belonging that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. Officer Chen, sensing the growing tension, made a decision. "Mr. Thompson, I think we have all the information we need here. Again, I'd apologize for the disturbance." He turned to his partner, nodding towards their cruiser. "We'll be on our way now." But as the officers prepared to leave, a new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Wait." All eyes turned to see an elderly man making his way down the sidewalk, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Mr. Grayson, the neighborhood's oldest resident and a respected figure in the community. "I saw everything," Mr. Grayson said, his voice wavering but determined. "I was sitting on my porch, like I do every afternoon. John and Tom were working on that car for a good hour. There was nothing suspicious about it." His words seemed to break a spell. Suddenly, other neighbors were stepping forward, offering their own accounts. "I saw them too," said Mrs. Patel from 2 doors down. "John even waved to me when I walked by with my dog." As more voices joined the chorus, Margaret felt her world shrinking. She'd been so sure, so convinced of what she'd seen. But now she was forced to confront the possibility that what she'd seen had been filtered through a lens of her own making, colored by fears and prejudices she hadn't even realized she harbored. John watched as the narrative shifted, feeling a mix of vindication and weariness. This wasn't the first time he'd faced suspicion because of the color of his skin, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point, not just for him and his family, but for the entire neighborhood. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, John turned to Sarah and their children. "Let's go inside," he said softly. "I think we all need a moment to process this." But even as they retreated to the safety of their home, John knew this wasn't over. The conversations that needed to happen, the hard, uncomfortable conversations about race, about belonging, about what it truly means to be a community, were just beginning. And as night fell over the neighborhood, as porch lights flickered on and families gathered around dinner tables, the events of the afternoon hung in the air like a challenge. Would they rise to meet it? Would they find a way to bridge the divides that had been so starkly revealed? Or would they retreat into the comfort of the familiar, leaving the wounds to fester beneath the surface? The answer to those questions remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: life in this quiet suburban neighborhood would never be quite the same again. As the Thompson family retreated into their home, the neighborhood buzzed with whispered conversations and uneasy glances. The incident had cracked the veneer of suburban tranquility, exposing the raw nerves beneath. For John and Sarah, the evening was spent in quiet reflection, their children's innocent questions about why the police had come serving as painful reminders of the world they'd have to navigate. Across the street, Margaret Wilson paced her living room, replaying the afternoon's events in her mind. The shame of her actions warred with a lifetime of ingrained beliefs and fears. She'd always considered herself a good person. How could she reconcile that with what she'd done? As night fell, she made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could have foreseen. The next morning, as John left for work, he found a plate of cookies on his porch with a note from Margaret. "I'm sorry," it read simply. John stared at the offering, a complex mix of emotions swirling in his chest. The gesture was well-intentioned, but was it enough? Could homemade cookies bridge the chasm of mistrust and misunderstanding that had opened between them? At the district attorney's office, John found himself the center of attention. Word of the incident had spread, and his colleagues alternated between expressions of sympathy and awkward attempts at humor. "Guess they didn't know they were messing with the wrong brother, huh?" joked one well-meaning but tone-deaf coworker. John forced a smile, all too aware of the delicate balance he had to maintain in this predominantly white professional space. Meanwhile, Sarah Thompson faced her own challenges. As she dropped the kids off at school, she couldn't help but notice the way other parents watched her, their gazes a mix of curiosity and unease. In the teacher's lounge, where she volunteered twice a week, conversations hushed when she entered the room. The incident had made her family local celebrities of sorts, but it was a spotlight that burned rather than illuminated. Officer Chen, troubled by the events of the previous day, decided to dig deeper. Something about the call hadn't sat right with him, and as he reviewed the dispatch logs, a pattern began to emerge. There had been a noticeable uptick in calls reporting suspicious activity in the area since the Thompsons had moved in. None had led to arrests, but the implications were clear and unsettling. As the week progressed, the neighborhood found itself divided. Some, like Tom Johnson and the elderly Mr. Grayson, made a point of being more openly friendly to the Thompsons, their exaggerated waves and loud greetings a well-meaning but somewhat awkward attempt at solidarity. Others, uncomfortable with the spotlight the incident had thrown on their community, withdrew, their curtains drawn and their interactions curt. Margaret, driven by a mix of guilt and a genuine desire to make amends, threw herself into organizing a neighborhood barbecue. "It's time we all got to know each other better," she declared to anyone who would listen. But as she went door to door with invitations, she encountered resistance. "I don't think that's a good idea, Margaret," Mrs. Anderson said, her lips pursed. "Some people might see it as making excuses for what happened." The proposed barbecue became a Rorschach test for the community, revealing deep-seated attitudes and fears. Those in favor saw it as a chance for healing and understanding. Those against viewed it as an attempt to paper over serious issues. The debate spilled over onto the neighborhood's online forum, with increasingly heated exchanges that did little to bridge the divide. For John, each day brought new challenges. At work, he found himself assigned to a high-profile case involving police misconduct. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested. How would he balance his personal experiences with his professional duties? And how would his handling of the case be perceived by both his colleagues and his community? Sarah, determined to turn the incident into a teaching moment, approached her children's school about incorporating more diverse literature and history into the curriculum. Her suggestions were met with polite nods and vague promises to look into it, leaving her frustrated and increasingly convinced that real change would require more than just good intentions. As tensions in the neighborhood simmered, an unexpected ally emerged. Ethan Rodriguez, the young officer who had asked for John's ID, reached out to apologize. Over coffee at a neutral location, Ethan opened up about his own struggles as a Latino officer, the pressure to fit in with the department culture, and his growing awareness of systemic issues in policing. John listened, seeing in Ethan's earnest face a reflection of his younger self, grappling with the complexities of navigating a world not designed for them. Their conversation, overheard by other patrons in the coffee shop, sparked a new round of discussions in the community. Some saw Ethan's actions as a betrayal of his fellow officers. Others viewed it as a brave step towards accountability and reform. The local paper caught wind of the story, and suddenly, their quiet suburb found itself at the center of a larger debate about race, policing, and community relations. As the date of Margaret's proposed barbecue approached, the neighborhood held its collective breath. Would it be a turning point, a chance for real dialogue and understanding, or would it expose the rifts in their community even further? John and Sarah debated whether to attend, weighing the potential for positive change against the emotional toll of being in the spotlight once again. The night before the event, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension in the air, John sat on his porch, lost in thought. The past weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions and experiences, forcing him to confront issues he'd spent a career fighting against in the courtroom but had hoped to leave behind in his personal life. As he watched the lightning flicker in the distance, John realized that tomorrow's barbecue was more than just a neighborhood gathering. It was a crossroads, a moment that would define not just his place in this community, but the community's identity itself. Whatever happened, there would be no going back to the way things were. With a deep sigh, John stood up and went inside, knowing that the decisions he and Sarah made in the coming hours would have repercussions far beyond their picket fence. The storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and all they could do was brace for impact and hope that when the dust settled, they'd find a way forward together. The morning of the neighborhood barbecue dawned gray and humid, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As John Thompson stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his collar, he caught Sarah's eye in the reflection. No words were needed. They both understood the weight of the day ahead. Their decision to attend hadn't come easily, but they knew that absence would speak louder than presence. Across the street, Margaret Wilson was a whirlwind of nervous energy, setting up tables and checking the grill for the 100th time. Her husband, Bob, watched her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "Maggie," he said gently, "maybe we should postpone the weather," but Margaret cut him off with a sharp look. "It has to be today, Bob. We can't put this off any longer." As the designated start time approached, neighbors began to trickle into Margaret's backyard. The atmosphere was tense, conversations stilted, and smiles forced. Mrs. Patel arrived with a dish of homemade samosas, her normally cheerful demeanor subdued. Tom Johnson, still feeling guilty about his role in the incident, hovered near the grill, offering to help, but mostly getting in the way. When the Thompsons finally made their entrance, a hush fell over the gathering. John, Sarah, and their children stood at the gate for a moment, taking in the scene. It was Sarah who made the first move, guiding her family forward with a gentle hand on John's back. As they moved through the crowd, neighbors parted like the Red Sea, unsure how to act or what to say. Margaret bustled over, her face a mask of determined cheer. "John, Sarah, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice a little too loud. "Can I get you something to drink?" The exchange was painfully polite, the undercurrent of tension palpable to everyone watching. As the afternoon wore on, conversations remained surface level, with neighbors carefully avoiding any mention of the incident that had brought them all together. The children, oblivious to the adults' discomfort, played on the lawn, their laughter a stark contrast to the strained atmosphere. Officer Chen arrived late, still in uniform, having just gotten off his shift. His presence added another layer of complexity to the already charged atmosphere. Some neighbors greeted him warmly, while others eyed him with suspicion. John nodded to him from across the yard, a silent acknowledgement of their shared discomfort. As dark clouds began to gather overhead, mirroring the mood of the gathering, Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. The old man had been watching the proceedings with a troubled expression, and now he spoke, his voice cutting through the murmur of forced small talk. "I think," he said slowly, "that we need to talk about what happened. Really talk about it." His words landed like a stone in a still pond, ripples of tension spreading outward. Margaret's smile faltered, and John straightened, his hand finding Sarah's in a gesture of solidarity. For a moment, no one spoke, the only sound the distant rumble of thunder. It was Ethan Rodriguez, the young officer who had reached out to John, who broke the silence. "Mr. Grayson's right," he said, stepping forward. "We can't pretend everything's okay when it's not." His words seemed to open a floodgate, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, years of unspoken thoughts and feelings pouring out. "I didn't mean any harm," Margaret blurted out, tears in her eyes. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." "Safe from what, exactly?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet but firm. The conversation quickly heated up, with neighbors taking sides and old grievances bubbling to the surface. Tom Johnson defended his friendship with John, while others questioned why they hadn't seen the Thompsons at previous neighborhood events. Officer Chen found himself cornered by a group demanding to know about police procedures and racial profiling. As voices rose and tempers flared, John stood silent, watching the scene unfold. He'd seen this before, in courtrooms and community meetings, the moment when pretense falls away and raw truth emerges. But this was different. This was personal. Just as it seemed the gathering might dissolve into chaos, a bright flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The heavens opened, rain pouring down in sheets. Neighbors scrambled for cover, rushing under the patio awning or into Margaret's house. In the confusion, John found himself face to face with Margaret, both of them soaked to the skin. For a moment, they just looked at each other, all the hurt, fear, and misunderstanding of the past weeks hanging between them like a physical presence. "I'm sorry," Margaret said again, but this time it wasn't just a platitude scribbled on a note. It was a beginning. Before John could respond, another clap of thunder shook the ground, and the lights in Margaret's house flickered ominously. As rain continued to pour and the wind picked up, it became clear that this was no ordinary summer storm. Neighbors huddled together, previous tensions momentarily forgotten in the face of a more immediate concern. Officer Chen's radio crackled to life with reports of downed power lines and flash flood warnings. In that moment, as they all looked to John, the prosecutor, The newcomer, the man they had misjudged for guidance, he realized that this crisis might be the catalyst they needed. With rain lashing against the windows and the storm raging outside, John took a deep breath. What he said next, he knew, would determine not just the outcome of this gathering, but the future of their community. As all eyes turned to him, John began to speak, his words barely audible over the howling wind, but carrying a weight that everyone in the room could feel. The storm had brought them together, but it would be up to them to decide what happened when the clouds cleared. As John's voice filled the room, mixing with the sound of rain and thunder, the neighbors of Oakwood Drive found themselves on the brink of a transformation, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. As John's words began to bridge the divide in Margaret's storm-battered living room, a sudden commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see flashing lights approaching. Officer Chen's radio crackled again, this time with an urgent message that made him pale. "There's been a break-in reported 2 blocks over," he announced, his voice tight with concern. With this storm, backup might be delayed. The room fell silent, the implications sinking in. Their neighborhood, already on edge, was now facing a potential threat from outside. John exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "We need to secure the area and make sure everyone's accounted for," John said, his prosecutor's instincts kicking in. The neighbors, who moments ago had been at odds, now looked to him for leadership. As they organized into groups, checking on houses and helping secure loose items from the storm, the dynamics began to shift. Margaret, her earlier guilt transformed into determination, took charge of coordinating communications. Tom Johnson, eager to prove his worth, volunteered to help Officer Chen patrol the streets. Sarah, drawing on her experience as a school volunteer, organized activities to keep the children calm and occupied. As she worked, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her realize just how much their presence had shaken up long-held assumptions in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, John and Ethan found themselves partnered up, moving from house to house in the driving rain. As they worked, Ethan opened up about the pressures he faced as a young officer, torn between his training and his growing awareness of systemic issues. John listened, recognizing the complexity of Ethan's position and seeing an opportunity for real change. As the night wore on and the storm intensified, reports came in of rising water levels and power outages across the city. The break-in, it turned out, was a false alarm. A tree branch had shattered a window, but the scare had galvanized the community. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now worked side by side, boarding up windows and helping move valuables to higher ground. In the midst of the chaos, Mr. Grayson suffered a fall, the stress and exertion taking a toll on his frail body. As John and Sarah rushed to his aid, they discovered something unexpected. Old photographs that had spilled from a box Mr. Grayson had been trying to save from the rising water. Among them was a faded image that made John's breath catch in his throat. The photo showed a much younger Mr. Grayson, standing proudly in front of a courthouse. Beside him was a man who could have been John's twin, same determined set of the jaw, same fire in the eyes. "That's my grandfather," John said in disbelief, his voice barely audible over the storm. Mr. Grayson, drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbled something about the old days and fighting the good fight. As they waited for the ambulance to navigate the flooded streets, John pieced together a story he'd never known, of his grandfather's work as a civil rights lawyer, of battles fought and sacrifices made right here in this community. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. Margaret, hovering nearby, looked stricken. "I had no idea," she whispered, the weight of her recent actions hitting her anew. Others murmured in surprise, long-held narratives about their neighborhood's history suddenly called into question. As the ambulance finally arrived, its siren cutting through the howling wind, John found himself at a crossroads. The storm had laid bare not just the physical vulnerabilities of their community, but the historical and emotional fault lines running beneath the surface. The story of his grandfather offered a new perspective, a legacy he hadn't known he carried. With Mr. Grayson loaded into the ambulance and the storm showing no signs of letting up, John knew that the next few hours would be crucial, not just for weathering the physical storm, but for reshaping the future of their community. As he turned to address the gathered neighbors, John could feel the weight of history on his shoulders, the echoes of past struggles merging with the challenges of the present. The night was far from over, and as another flash of lightning illuminated the determined faces around him, John realized that the true test of their neighborhood's character was just beginning. The storm had brought them together, but it would be the choices they made in its aftermath that would truly define them. With a deep breath, John began to outline a plan, not just for getting through the night, but for rebuilding their community on a foundation of understanding and shared purpose. As he spoke, the neighbors of Oakwood Drive found themselves on the cusp of a transformation, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves, their history, and each other. The storm raged on, but within its fury, the seeds of change had begun to take root. What would grow from this tempestuous night was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: life on Oakwood Drive would never be the same again. As dawn broke over Oakwood Drive, the storm finally began to subside. The neighborhood, battered but unbroken, emerged to survey the damage. Trees were down, basements flooded, and debris littered the streets. But something else had changed too, something less tangible but far more profound. John Thompson stood on his front porch, watching his neighbors help each other clear fallen branches and pump out flooded basements. The night's events had forged unexpected alliances and exposed long-buried truths. As he sipped his coffee, Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. Before John could answer, they spotted Margaret Wilson making her way across the street, looking determined despite her obvious exhaustion. As she reached their porch, she took a deep breath. "John, Sarah, I owe you more than just an apology," she began, her voice wavering but resolute. "I've spent the night thinking about everything. About what I did, about your grandfather's story, about the kind of community we want to be." Just then, Officer Chen's patrol car pulled up, Ethan Rodriguez at the wheel. They stepped out, looking grim. "We got a situation," Chen announced as he approached. The storm caused a lot of damage at the community center, the place where they were planning to hold the town hall meeting on police reform next week. It's flooded. A murmur went through the small crowd that had gathered. The town hall had been a contentious issue, with many in the neighborhood arguing against it. Now, it seemed, nature had made the decision for them. But John saw an opportunity. "What if we held it here?" he suggested, his mind racing. "Not just the meeting, but a whole series of discussions. We could use my garage, Margaret's backyard, the Patels' driveway. Make it a real neighborhood event." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a burst of conversation. Margaret's eyes widened. "You do that? After everything?" John nodded, looking around at his neighbors. "Last night showed us what we're capable of when we work together. Why stop now?" As the idea took hold, excitement began to build. Tom Johnson offered to handle logistics. Mrs. Patel volunteered to coordinate refreshments. Even Mr. Grayson, back from the hospital with a clean bill of health, offered his decades of community organizing experience. But it was Ethan who provided the final piece of the puzzle. "I've been thinking," he said, looking nervous but determined. "What if we didn't just talk about police reform? What if we actually started a pilot program right here? Community-oriented policing, with officers living in the neighborhoods they serve. I volunteer to be the first." The proposal sent a ripple of surprise through the group. It was bold, potentially controversial, but undeniably powerful. John felt a surge of hope. This was more than he could have imagined when he first moved to Oakwood Drive. As the neighbors dispersed to begin preparations, John felt a tug on his sleeve. It was Mr. Grayson, holding out a weathered envelope. "Found this when I was going through those old boxes," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "Thought you might want to see it." Inside was a letter, dated decades ago, from John's grandfather. As he read, John's eyes widened. The letter spoke of dreams for the future, of a community where people of all backgrounds could live together in harmony. It was a vision that had seemed impossible then, and sometimes felt just as distant now. But as John looked up, seeing Margaret and Sarah deep in conversation, watching Ethan chat easily with a group of teenagers, he realized something. They weren't just planning a town hall or a policing program. They were taking the first steps toward fulfilling a legacy that had been waiting for generations. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over Oakwood Drive, John felt a sense of purpose settle over him. The storm had done more than just damage property. It had washed away old prejudices and laid the groundwork for real change. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. Change never comes easily, and not everyone would be on board. But as John watched his neighbors working together, he knew they had crossed a threshold. Whatever came next, they would face it as a community. Just then, a news van pulled up, a reporter stepping out with a microphone in hand. "Mr. Thompson," she called, "we heard about what happened here last night. Care to comment on how a simple neighborhood dispute turned into a model for community policing?" John hesitated, looking around at his neighbors. They nodded encouragingly, and he stepped forward. As he began to speak, telling their story to the world, John realized that what had started as a misunderstanding on a quiet suburban street had become something much bigger, a blueprint for change that could inspire communities far beyond Oakwood Drive. The camera rolled, capturing not just John's words, but the scene behind him, a diverse group of neighbors, standing together, ready to build a new kind of community. It was a powerful image, one that would soon be broadcast across the nation, sparking conversations and inspiring action in ways none of them could have imagined. As John finished his impromptu interview, he turned back to his neighbors, his family, his community. There was work to be done, bridges to be built, and a future to be shaped. But for the first time since moving to Oakwood Drive, John felt truly at home. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a new day had dawned, not just for their neighborhood, but for all those watching who dared to dream of a better, more united future. In the weeks that followed, Oakwood Drive became a hive of activity. The neighborhood, once divided by suspicion and misunderstanding, now buzzed with a shared sense of purpose. John and Sarah's garage transformed into a makeshift community center, its walls covered with plans, ideas, and sign-up sheets for various initiatives. The town hall on police reform, originally planned for the flood-damaged community center, became a series of intimate gatherings spread across the neighborhood. Residents opened their homes and hearts, engaging in honest, sometimes difficult conversations about race, privilege, and community policing. Officer Chen and Ethan Rodriguez became regular fixtures, offering insights into law enforcement challenges while actively listening to residents' concerns. Margaret Wilson, determined to make amends, threw herself into organizing these events. Her organizational skills, once used to keep a watchful eye on the neighborhood, now served to bring people together. She worked closely with Sarah, and the two women formed an unlikely but effective partnership. As summer turned to fall, the changes in Oakwood Drive began to attract attention beyond their little suburb. Local news stations ran follow-up stories, and community leaders from neighboring towns came to observe their meetings. John found himself increasingly called upon to speak at events, sharing the story of their neighborhood's transformation. One crisp October evening, as golden leaves carpeted the lawns of Oakwood Drive, the neighborhood gathered for a special celebration. Tables laden with potluck dishes lined the street, strings of lights twinkled overhead, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. It was a far cry from the tension-filled barbecue that had been interrupted by the storm months earlier. Mr. Grayson, now fully recovered and reinvigorated by the community's energy, stood to make a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice strong despite his years, "and to the power of facing our fears and prejudices head-on." As glasses clinked, John caught Sarah's eye across the crowd, both of them marveling at how far they'd come. The pilot program for community-oriented policing, spearheaded by Ethan, was showing promising results. Crime rates had dropped, but more importantly, trust was building. Residents who once viewed the police with suspicion now greeted officers by name. Ethan, who had moved into a small apartment on Oakwood Drive, became a familiar and welcome face in the neighborhood. Tom Johnson, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed, decided to run for city council on a platform of community engagement and police reform. His campaign headquarters? His own garage, mirroring the impromptu community center John had created. The Paddle family, emboldened by the neighborhood's newfound openness, organized a Diwali celebration that brought together residents from all backgrounds. The street glowed with lanterns and rang with music, a vibrant testament to the cultural richness they'd nearly overlooked. As winter approached, the neighborhood faced a new challenge. The community center, still in disrepair from the summer storm, was in danger of being permanently closed. Without hesitation, the residents of Oakwood Drive mobilized. They organized fundraisers, pooled their skills for renovation work, and lobbied the city council for support. John, drawing on his legal expertise and newfound community connections, helped navigate the bureaucratic hurdles. Sarah coordinated teams of volunteers, While Margaret's meticulous planning kept the project on track, even the children got involved, holding bake sales and car washes to contribute. On a cold December morning, residents gathered for the community center's grand reopening. As the ribbon was cut, John couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started with a misunderstanding and a phone call to the police had led to a community transformed. The center itself stood as a symbol of their progress. The main hall, once a bland municipal space, now featured a mural designed and painted by neighborhood children, depicting a diverse group of people coming together. A new wing housed a police outreach office, where residents could interact with officers in a non-threatening environment. As people filed into the building, John overheard snippets of conversation that warmed his heart. Mrs. Anderson, once wary of change, was chatting animatedly with Mrs. Patel about starting a multicultural cooking class. A group of teenagers, including Ethan's younger brother, were discussing plans for a youth-led community service initiative. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, John found himself standing in the quiet of the center's new library. The shelves were lined with books donated by residents, each one a piece of the community's collective knowledge and experience. His grandfather's letter, framed and hanging on the wall, caught his eye. As he read those decades-old words again, John felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Margaret, her eyes misty with emotion. "I owe you an apology," she said softly. "No, I owe your whole family an apology. I've lived here for 30 years, and I never knew, never tried to understand." John shook his head, smiling gently. "What matters is what we do now, moving forward. That's what my grandfather would have wanted. That's what this community needs." They were interrupted by Sarah, who entered with their children in tow. "There you are," she said, her face glowing with happiness. "Everyone's asking for you. I think they want a speech." As John made his way back to the main hall, he was struck by the sight before him. The room was filled with faces that, just months ago, had been strangers at best and adversaries at worst. Now, they were neighbors in the truest sense of the word. People who cared for and supported one another, who celebrated their differences as much as their common ground. Taking a deep breath, John stepped up to the microphone. The room fell quiet, all eyes turning to him expectantly. "A few months ago," he began, "I stood on my front lawn, surrounded by police cars, feeling like an outsider in my own neighborhood. Today, I stand here surrounded by friends, by a community that has shown incredible courage and compassion." As he spoke, John saw nods of agreement and a few tears being wiped away. He talked about the challenges they'd faced and overcome, the bonds they'd formed, and the work that still lay ahead. "What we built here isn't just about one neighborhood," he concluded. "It's a model for what's possible when we open our hearts and minds, when we face our fears and biases, when we choose understanding over suspicion and unity over division." The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the room with a palpable sense of hope and determination. As John stepped down, he was engulfed in hugs and handshakes. He caught sight of Ethan, standing proudly in his uniform, chatting easily with a group of residents. Margaret was already deep in discussion with Tom about their next community project. Later that night, as John and Sarah walked home hand in hand, the streets of Oakwood Drive quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, they paused to look back at the community center. Light spilled from its windows, and a sound of laughter and music drifted on the cold air. "Did you ever imagine this when we first moved here?" Sarah asked, squeezing his hand. John shook his head, smiling. "Never, but I'm glad we stayed. I'm glad we fought for this." As they continued home, John reflected on the journey they'd all taken. It hadn't been easy, and there would be more challenges ahead. But they had laid a foundation of trust, understanding, and mutual respect that would serve them well in the future. The story of Oakwood Drive, of a misunderstanding that led to transformation, of a community that chose growth over fear, was just beginning. And as John looked up at the stars twinkling in the clear night sky, he felt a profound sense of hope. Not just for their neighborhood, but for all the other communities out there, waiting for their own moment of change. The lessons learned on Oakwood Drive, of confronting biases, building bridges, and creating true community, were ones that could ripple out far beyond their suburban streets. It was a story worth telling, worth sharing, and most importantly, worth living. As John and Sarah reached their front porch, they paused for one last look at their neighborhood. Oakwood Drive, once just a street, was now a home in the deepest sense of the word. and tomorrow would bring a new day, full of possibilities. In this community, they had all built together.